Hi, I'm Lauren from the Student Learning Support Service, and in this module we're going to be talking about how to integrate evidence into our assignments. Now there are two parts to this module. The first part is about the language that we use when we are integrating evidence, and the second part is about how to quote and paraphrase effectively. So let's get started by thinking firstly about what evidence is. Now, evidence, as I'm sure you know, can be made up of a range of different materials. It is very simply any kind of logical reasoning, so an argument that is well made. It can be facts, it can be statistics, of course, authoritative opinions, so those scholars that we refer to and their arguments or theories. It can, depending on your discipline, often be made up of primary accounts, and these might be books or films or historical documents or maps or any other kind of primary data, and of course research findings and evidence that's garnered through direct data collection. Now this evidence isn't going to go too much into what evidence is, so I want you to check out the video What is Evidence in case you need a little bit more background about what constitutes evidence at university. Because what's important to us today is how we use evidence, and there are two primary ways that we use it. Firstly, to demonstrate our understanding or knowledge of a topic, and secondly, to support an argument or claim that we are making. But what's really important is that evidence must have a purpose. We don't just integrate evidence for the sake of it because we feel like our lecturer is expecting to see something in particular, because we've found something really interesting that we want to share, or because we don't quite understand what the original author is saying, but we feel like we should reference them. Maybe because that way we can fake our way into showing that we understand something. This is not how we want to use evidence. Evidence must serve a purpose, and so it's really important to begin by asking yourself what that purpose is. If you are using evidence to demonstrate your understanding or your knowledge about a topic, that purpose might be to explain or define a particular process, method, or experience. But when we get into the much more complicated territory of demonstrating our critical thinking abilities, our ability to analyze and synthesize information, then we must do something more with this evidence. And then our purpose might be to support a claim or premise and therefore contribute to our own logical reasoning, how we are developing our argument. It might be to acknowledge a counterpoint or rebut a counterpoint, or to offer a comparison or contrast. It might be to evaluate the argument of somebody else, or it might be to justify an interpretation of a particular text, say we're reading and analysing a book, or a decision that we've made. For example, if we want to justify why we took certain actions during a placement. And so at this level, evidence is not just showing our understanding or knowledge about a topic, it is demonstrating our critical thinking skills. And for that reason, it is super important that our evidence is relevant, reasonable, and clearly connected to the claim. So there's a couple of important questions that we have to ask ourselves. Why are we using this particular piece of evidence? Why not another quote? Why not another statistic? And how does this piece of evidence support my point? How does it support the claim that I'm making, the argument that I'm making, the justification that I'm making, and the conclusion that I want to reach? Remember that this is contributing to your own line of reasoning, or how you are logically connecting your ideas together to convince your reader of your conclusion. Remember that most of the time in your writing, what you are being assessed on is not necessarily a particular answer. Two different essays, for example, might come to two completely different answers or conclusions based on the same question, and they might get exactly the same result, because the important thing is how you have got to that answer, the process by which you demonstrate that answer. And this is where how we integrate our evidence becomes really, really integral. When we're writing an argument, for example, which we may do without even realizing it, if, say, we are justifying a decision that we made on a placement or a particular method that we chose for a research report, simply making a claim and then putting evidence next to it doesn't constitute an argument if that claim and that evidence are not connected logically and clearly. And this is where we can use discourse markers and reporting verbs, which act as logical connectors between our own thoughts, ideas, claims, and conclusions, and the evidence that we're presenting. They indicate why we've included particular evidence and its relevance, and they can also offer some insight into our attitudes towards that evidence. So let's start with discourse markers. These very simply are words and phrases that link ideas logically together, and you're probably familiar with them. You use them in your work all the time without knowing that this is what they're called. These are words like because, given that, due to, alternatively, since, furthermore, and however. Reporting verbs are those words that introduce or report people's work. They are verbs, so they're words like states, agrees, explains, discusses, alleges, disagrees, etc. Now, as I said, you are already using all of these words in your writing. I am very sure of that. And so I don't want you to worry too much about what these phrases and words are actually called, but more, my point is to really think about how you can use these to the greatest effect when integrating your evidence. Because discourse markers and reporting verbs don't just introduce evidence, they demonstrate how we are using it. Do we agree with something? Do we disagree? Are we offering a critique or a comparison or an evaluation? So if we are just introducing our evidence, for example, we might use words like according to Smith. Smith claims that, as Smith illustrates, Watson defines evidence as, research findings indicate that, or there is evidence to show that. Now, most of these are reporting verbs, but you can see that there's a range of different reporting verbs that we can use that kind of give a little bit of a different flavor to our writing. But let's have a look a little bit more closely now at how we can do something like show support. So I might use consequently, as Smith suggests, as Smith indicates. In addition to Smith's point, Watson suggests, or furthermore, Watson states, or Watson agrees, or additionally, Smith maintains that, or Watson supports. There's a huge range of supporting verbs and discourse markers that you can use. And as you can see in many of these examples, I've used them in combination with each other to help me make those connections even clearer. So if we want to show disagreement, we can use words like in contrast, Smith states, or on the other hand, Watson says, or however, Watson disagrees, stating that, or contrary to Watson's point, Smith suggests, or Smith contends that, Watson disputes this, arguing that, Smith criticizes, the list goes on. You can find a list of these in some of our guides. I particularly recommend having a look at our guide on writing an argument, which has more examples of these. So let's have a look at this in practice. So for example, if I was to write, it is important for students to get adequate sleep when revising for exams. Smith states that students should sleep according to their preferred rhythms. Watson says that students should create a routine. Both authors write that sleep plays an important role in cognitive processing. The link between sleep and students' exam performance must be better understood. So I've integrated two pieces of evidence here. However, how they're connected to my claim, which is the line at the bottom, the link between sleep and students' exam performance must be better understood, and the kind of importance of this subject, it is important for students to get adequate sleep when revising for exams, is not necessarily clear. It is also not clear what the relationship between these two pieces of evidence is. So I'm going to have another go at this and use some better, more informative discourse markers and reporting verbs. It is important for students to get adequate sleep when revising for exams. Smith advises that students should study according to their preferred natural rhythms. By contrast, Watson contends that students should create a strict routine. Nevertheless, while their arguments differ, both authors concede that sleep plays an important role in cognitive processing. Therefore, the link between sleep and exam performance must be better understood. Now, I know that this is a very simplistic version of an argumentative paragraph, but I hope that you can see that there is a much clearer connection now between both my premise, my point about the importance of sleep and its connection to cognition, and how these two authors come to support that claim. And they support it in a way that might be surprising because they do disagree with each other. But I'm showing how that disagreement is relevant to me. I could also, of course, go further, evaluate and expand on these if I was writing this in a full essay. So this, just keep in mind, is a very short version of it, but I hope it illustrates the difference between using just our plain old reporting verbs like says and states versus choosing verbs that are really going to do some work for us and choosing those discourse markers that help us to integrate our evidence in a way that does show its relevance, its point, and its connection to my own ideas. So let's discuss quoting and paraphrasing. But first, how do we use evidence? Very brief recap. We use evidence to demonstrate our understanding or knowledge of a topic, and importantly, to analyze, synthesize, and evaluate the ideas of others. And we usually do this in two key ways. We do this by quoting, which is when we copy exactly the words of another. We might call this verbatim, which means exactly as they appear, and integrate this into our work. Or we might, more commonly, paraphrase, which is when we take the ideas of somebody else and express those ideas in our own words. And importantly, when we are doing both of these things, we must cite and include a reference. We might also integrate things like graphs and figures, which I'm going to discuss very briefly at the end of this video. Now, direct quotes involve using the exact words of the original author, and we use these for very particular purposes in our writing. They are not common, though it does depend on your discipline. You will quote more commonly in the arts and humanities, for example, than you do in the sciences, so it's important to be aware of the conventions of your discipline and have a look at publications, academic peer-referred journals in your own field to get a sense of how common direct quoting actually is. But very broadly speaking, there's a few key reasons why we might choose to quote rather than paraphrase or summarize. And those include whether or not it is a very famous quote, and that might mean that it is a famous quote or key statement from an author in the field, particularly if it is a very key author in the field. It also might be to introduce or define a key term. It's because maybe it's a major statement that we will then discuss further or elaborate on or deconstruct or evaluate, or it might be something that we cannot possibly express in another way without diminishing its impact or its meaning, and that usually is closely tied with it being a key statement in the field. So when it comes to the mechanics of quoting, there's two ways that we generally use our quotes, and that is a short quote and a long quote. Short quotes, usually less than 3 lines or about 30 words, more or less. And this is when we integrate that quote into the body of our own sentences using quotation marks and a citation, of course. We use quotation marks to accurately indicate exactly where the quote begins and ends. And do remember that you can include just a section of a sentence of somebody else's work. Remember that when we integrate a quote into our own sentence, it becomes grammatically part of our own sentence, which means that it should flow completely. And that means that we may only use a phrase or a clause of that quote rather than the entire sentence. We can actually just grab a couple of words if that's something that we need to do and integrate that into our own sentence. And of course, we're going to include a reference according to whichever style we are using. Now, longer quotations are those that are more than 3 lines or more than about 30 words. These are less common, but again, check the conventions of your field. We format these in quite a different way. We do not use quotation marks when we are including a long quote. Instead, the quote is separated from the body of our text, and we use indentation. Sometimes we might use a different sized font and a new line to indicate that this is a quote. So it becomes a paragraph of its own, but it still needs to be introduced in the same way that we would introduce a short quote. So use that reporting verb, use a discourse marker, and then include your indented paragraph beneath. So remember, quotes must appear exactly as they appear in the original, and there's a couple of tools that we can use just in case we need to kind of shape them to make them fit. The first is ellipses, which is those 3 little dots. These inside a quote indicate that part of that quote has been removed. We might also use square brackets if we are adding extra information. So any words that are our own inside that quote, we put within square brackets, and we indicate errors with square brackets and the word sick. Keep in mind that different referencing conventions may dictate whether or not you use single quotation marks or double quotation marks. For example, APA referencing dictates that you use double, whereas in most other conventions in Australia, we use single quotation marks. And if you are quoting inside a quote, use the opposite marks to whatever you use. So for example, if you use single quotation marks, but you're referencing a quote inside that quote, you will use double quotes for your inside quote. All right, so now let's talk about paraphrasing, the really tricky one. I know a lot of people have problems with paraphrasing. It is difficult. So let's start by thinking firstly about why we paraphrase. Very simply, paraphrasing allows us to better demonstrate our own understanding of an idea. Paraphrasing allows us to maintain our own voice, and that is really important in our own writing. Remember, we are writing our own line of reasoning. We are creating our own argument. And yes, that evidence from others is very important, but it must clearly fit within our own argument and our own style. So let's just use an example to get us started. So here is a block of original text. The claim that there is more than one way to approach a problem is an important one because it illustrates one of the central ideas of academic culture. That is, that knowledge develops through debate and argument. Each scholar presents ideas he or she thinks best explain the real world and criticizes ideas that he or she does not agree with. As students, you are expected to learn how to take part in this continuing debate. So let's have a look at a not so well paraphrased version of this and then talk about what's gone wrong. The view that there is more than one way to look at a problem is central to academic culture. Knowledge develops through argument, and students are expected to take part in this ongoing argument. Now, on the surface, this might look fine. After all, it is much shorter than the original, isn't it? And quite often when we paraphrase, we do end up with something that is shorter, and we should hopefully end up with something that is shorter than the original. But there are quite a few problems with this. Firstly, the original author is not acknowledged. So we have a major problem with a lack of citation, and that, of course, constitutes an issue with academic integrity. The next problem is some of these words are very similar. Yes, they've used synonyms, but synonym substitution is insufficient in paraphrasing. We cannot simply change one word for another. And a word of warning on that, sometimes when we do, we use the incorrect synonym and we actually distort the meaning of the original. Another problem with this is that the order of information is exactly the same. So here's some tips for paraphrasing much more effectively. Firstly, it is really important when paraphrasing that you understand the original. If you don't understand the original author's words, you will not be able to paraphrase it effectively. And if you don't understand, I recommend that you go back and have a look at other texts. Look at some reference guides, look at your textbooks. You can even go to Wikipedia if you have to in order to just find that definition that might help you find your way. Once you have an understanding, a clear understanding, there are a few things that you can do. Firstly, don't look at the original when you are writing your own version. I recommend covering it up, and then you might try just writing down the key ideas that you need from that original. Try dot points. Don't worry about sentence structure yet. Think again about the purpose of this evidence. This is why purpose is so important, and I was talking about it in the first half of this module. Why do you need to use this evidence? What is the key idea here that you need your reader to know? How is it relevant to what you're going to say? Remember to concentrate on the idea and not on the text itself. You want to create as much distance between the original and yourself as you can. Another thing you might try is explaining it out loud as though to a friend. Imagine that I have asked you, oh, hey, what was that paragraph in that reading about? You know, say it out loud. If you can do that, you can paraphrase it. Then use those dot points to construct your own sentences. Then you can be sure that you're writing in your own style while maintaining the integral part of that key meaning and its purpose to your own writing. And so if I've done this well, I might end up with something that looks a little bit more like this. Academic culture is based on the premise that there are many ways to view a problem, and scholars argue the merits of their perspective over others' views, thus creating knowledge. Students need to learn to participate in this process. So finally, let's have a little look at how to integrate other forms of data, primarily research findings. So if you have information such as statistical data, or you've run an experiment and you need to display that data, firstly, you need to think about how best to present what is often quite complicated information. So you might consider, for example, a table, which is numerical values or text displayed in rows and columns, or a figure. And a figure is any type of illustration. It might be a chart, a map, a graph, or a photograph. So label each table or figure with a brief explanatory title and include a caption beneath that table with your reference, and ensure that the tables and figures are clearly connected to your own writing. So that might mean using those numbers in your writing. Refer to figure 1.1, for example. To find out how to do this in more detail, refer to the referencing conventions according to your own style. Finally, when we've quoted, paraphrased, or included a table or a figure, we must acknowledge our sources. Check the style guides that are relevant to what you are studying. You can find those on the Student Learning Support Service Flow page, or check out our referencing fundamentals video if you want to learn a little bit more about when and why we reference. So that's all for integrating evidence. Remember, there are two parts to this if you haven't watched both parts, how to use the right language and knowing our purpose when integrating evidence, and of course, using quotes and paraphrasing effectively. If you haven't already, have a look at the video, What is Evidence? You might also find it useful to have a look at what is an argument, and of course, referencing fundamentals and our referencing guides. Thank you, everyone. Good luck.